The racist resort staff humiliated Michelle and Barack Obama, but what happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching us from. The summer sun was setting in hues of gold and crimson, casting long shadows across the winding road that led to the secluded luxury resort. Barack Obama rested his arm on the open window of the car, letting the gentle breeze play with his shirt sleeve. He glanced over at Michelle, who was seated beside him, her gaze fixed on the rolling hills and the lavish villas dotting the landscape. "It's beautiful," Michelle said, breaking the comfortable silence. Her voice held a note of relief, as if the idyllic surroundings were finally helping her shed the weight of the past months. "I think this is exactly what we need." Barack chuckled softly. "Agreed. Though, I have to admit, I'm a little worried about how I'll handle not having to make any grand statements or navigate through endless meetings. This might just ruin my rhythm." Michelle turned to him with a playful smirk. "You'll survive, Mr. Former President. I think even you deserve to just be you for a while." The car veered into the resort's driveway, lined with the palm trees swaying lazily in the evening breeze. The grandeur of the main building came into view, a sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion with arched windows and terracotta roofs. It was the kind of place that promised privacy and indulgence, a retreat for the elite. As the valet approached, Michelle couldn't help but feel a flicker of anticipation. This was supposed to be their sanctuary, a place to recharge away from the relentless scrutiny that had become their norm. Yet, as they stepped into the cool, marble-floored lobby, something about the atmosphere seemed slightly off. The receptionist greeted them with a formal smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her polished demeanor faltered for the briefest of moments when she saw their faces. A subtle glance at her colleague, followed by a barely audible whisper, didn't escape Michelle's notice. Barack, ever the diplomat, handed over their reservation details with his characteristic charm. "We're looking forward to our stay," he said, his tone warm but measured. The receptionist nodded, but her response felt rehearsed. "Of course. Welcome to La Estrella. One moment, please." Michelle's unease deepened as she observed the interactions around them. Other guests were checked in swiftly, their arrivals met with genuine warmth. In contrast, their check-in seemed to drag, punctuated by furtive glances and a sense of hesitation. When the receptionist finally handed over their room key, it came with an apologetic smile. "Unfortunately, we had a mix-up with the reservations," she said. "We've placed you in one of our garden view suites for now. We'll do our best to resolve this as soon as possible." Michelle exchanged a quick glance with Barack. This wasn't what they'd booked. Their reservation had been clear, an ocean view suite with all the trimmings. Yet, before either of them could protest, the receptionist added, "Our manager will follow up with you tomorrow to ensure your stay meets your expectations." As they were escorted to their room, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that the mix-up was no accident. The suite, though tastefully decorated, was far from the luxurious escape they'd envisioned. The promised view of the ocean was replaced by a modest garden, and the faint scent of dampness lingered in the air. Michelle sank onto the edge of the bed, trying to mask her disappointment with humor. "Well, this is definitely the most understated luxury suite we've ever stayed in." Barack offered her a reassuring smile. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Maybe it's just a busy season. Tomorrow we'll sort it out." Yet, as they unpacked, Michelle's mind replayed the subtle cues she'd picked up in the lobby. The whispers, the sidelong glances, the delay. She couldn't dismiss the nagging suspicion that there was more to it than an honest mistake. Later that evening, they ventured out to explore the resort. The grounds were undeniably beautiful, with manicured lawns, sparkling pools, and pathways illuminated by soft golden lights. But even in this picturesque setting, something felt amiss. Other guests regarded them with curiosity, some even with thinly veiled judgment. It wasn't overt, but the undercurrent was palpable, a quiet message that they didn't quite belong. At dinner, the pattern continued. Seated near the back of the restaurant, they were among the last to be served. Their waiter, while professional, seemed distracted, fumbling with their orders and avoiding eye contact. Michelle noticed how other tables received warm, attentive service, complete with smiles and small talk. Here, there was only a strained politeness. Barack reached across the table to touch her hand. "You okay?" he asked gently. She forced a smile. "I'm fine, just observing." "Don't let it get to you," he said. "It's just our first day. Things will settle." But Michelle wasn't so sure. As they walked back to their room, the stillness of the night felt heavy, the earlier anticipation now replaced by a growing sense of unease. She glanced at Barack, who seemed lost in thought. Whatever this was, it wasn't what they had expected. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both knew this was just the beginning. The morning sun streamed through the sheer curtains of their suite, bathing the room in a soft golden light. Michelle stirred first, her sleep having been fitful. She sat up, taking a moment to shake off the lingering fog of unease from the previous evening. As she glanced around the room, a sense of dissonance returned. This place, which was meant to be a haven, felt anything but. Barack was already awake, seated by the small writing desk near the window with a cup of coffee in hand. His expression was calm, but Michelle recognized the faint crease in his brow, a telltale sign that his mind was churning. "Good morning," she said, crossing the room to sit beside him. "Morning," he replied, his voice gentle. "How'd you sleep?" She shrugged. "Could have been better. You?" He gave her a knowing look. "Same." After a pause, he added, "Let's give today a chance, though. See how things unfold." Michelle nodded, though a part of her couldn't shake the memory of the furtive glances and whispers from the staff. She resolved to approach the day with an open mind, but a quiet resolve was already taking root within her. If this was the start of a pattern, she wouldn't let it slide. Their first stop was breakfast on the terrace, where the ocean glimmered in the distance. They arrived early, hoping to avoid the busier hours, but the terrace was already buzzing with activity. Couples and families occupied tables adorned with white linens, their conversations a gentle hum against the backdrop of waves. Michelle and Barack chose a table near the edge, hoping for a peaceful meal. A waiter approached, his demeanor polite but perfunctory. He took their order without much eye contact and disappeared before they could request anything further. As the minutes stretched into nearly half an hour, Michelle's patience began to wane. Other tables, seated well after them, were already being served. Plates of eggs, pastries, and fruit made their way to guests who exchanged pleasantries with the staff, while their own table remained conspicuously empty. When the waiter finally returned, it was with only part of their order. Michelle noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he set down their plates, avoiding her gaze. "I'll bring the rest shortly," he mumbled before hurrying away. Barack leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral, but his eyes betraying a flicker of irritation. "It's just breakfast," he said, more to himself than to Michelle. "Is it?" Michelle replied, her voice low but firm. "This feels deliberate. I can't ignore it." Barack sighed, choosing his words carefully. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Maybe It's just disorganization. Michelle didn't argue, but her instincts told her otherwise. The subtle delays, the awkward interactions, these weren't the hallmarks of a well-run luxury resort. She decided to observe more before pressing the issue. Their plans for the day included a trip to the private beach, which had been one of the resort's main selling points. As they made their way down the stone path lined with hibiscus flowers, Michelle felt a flicker of optimism. The view was stunning. Turquoise waves lapping at pristine white sand. Shaded loungers arranged in neat rows under large umbrellas. Yet, as they approached, it became evident that their experience would be anything but idyllic. The loungers reserved under their name were occupied, and when they brought this to the attention of a beach attendant, his response was dismissive. "Sorry, but we can't move guests once they're settled," he said, his tone clipped. "You're welcome to wait until another lounger becomes available." Michelle's jaw tightened. "We specifically reserved these loungers when we booked. Surely there's a way to sort this out." The attendant didn't meet her gaze. "I'll see what I can do," he said before walking away without any urgency. Barack touched her arm, his tone conciliatory. "Let's just find a spot and enjoy the beach. It's not worth ruining the day over." But for Michelle, it wasn't just about the loungers, it was about the principle. The pattern of subtle dismissals and negligence was becoming impossible to ignore. The rest of the day unfolded much the same way. Housekeeping failed to service their room despite repeated assurances that it would be attended to. When Michelle called the front desk to inquire, the response was vague. "We'll send someone shortly." No one came. Later, as they strolled through the resort grounds, Michelle couldn't help but notice the way other guests reacted to them. Some cast curious glances, while others looked away quickly, as if avoiding acknowledgement. A few whispered among themselves, their expressions ranging from surprise to something darker, judgment, perhaps, or even disapproval. Dinner that evening brought the most jarring incident yet. They were seated near the back of the restaurant, away from the main dining area. The waiter assigned to their table seemed distracted, forgetting items they'd ordered and taking an inordinate amount of time to bring the simplest requests. At one point, Michelle observed him chatting animatedly with another table, his demeanor markedly different from the stilted interactions he'd had with them. When he finally returned, he placed a dish in front of Barack with a careless clatter, spilling a few drops of sauce onto the tablecloth. "Apologies," he muttered, though his tone lacked sincerity. Michelle's patience snapped. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice calm but steely. The waiter hesitated, his discomfort evident. "No, ma'am. Everything's fine." Barack reached for her hand under the table, a silent plea for restraint, but Michelle couldn't let it go. "Because it feels like there is. This isn't the level of service we expected when we booked this trip." The waiter nodded curtly and walked away without another word. Michelle felt a wave of frustration and something deeper, an all too familiar sense of being made to feel out of place. Back in their room that evening, Michelle sat on the edge of the bed, her thoughts swirling. "This isn't just bad service," she said finally, breaking the silence. "It's something more. You feel it too, don't you?" Barack looked at her for a long moment before replying, "I do. But I also know that reacting too strongly can sometimes backfire. We have to choose our battles." Michelle nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. She thought back to her childhood, to the countless times she'd faced subtle slights and overt prejudice. This felt achingly familiar, and the thought of letting it go unsettled her. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. When Michelle opened it, she found a housekeeper standing there, a young woman with dark eyes and a nervous demeanor. She introduced herself as Lucia and quickly apologized for the delay in servicing their room. "Thank you," Michelle said warmly. "We appreciate it." As Lucia stepped inside, Michelle noticed the hesitancy in her movements, as if she were afraid of making a mistake. When Michelle complimented her on her meticulous work, the woman's face lit up briefly before she returned to her reserved manner. Before leaving, Lucia glanced at Michelle and hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "If you ever need anything, just ask for me. My name is Lucia." Michelle watched her go, a strange sense of connection lingering. There was something in Lucia's eyes, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even solidarity, that hinted at stories untold. It was a small moment, but it stayed with her as the night wore on. Lying in bed, Michelle stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the day. The cracks were no longer subtle, they were widening, revealing something much deeper and more insidious beneath the surface. Barack woke early the next morning, slipping out of bed with practiced care not to disturb Michelle. The events of the past 2 days had left him restless, his thoughts an unresolved jumble of frustration and resolve. He stepped onto the small balcony, breathing in the salty tang of the ocean air. The horizon stretched endlessly before him, a serene contradiction to the disquiet that had settled within him. When Michelle joined him a short while later, her expression mirrored his. They didn't need words to acknowledge the unspoken truth between them. This wasn't a place where they were welcome. Not truly. Still, there was no clarity on how to proceed. Were they simply guests who had encountered bad service, or was something darker, more systemic, at play? After breakfast, another strained experience where their waiter barely acknowledged them, they decided to explore more of the resort grounds. It was during one of these quiet walks that the first veil of civility was ripped away. Barack had wandered ahead, drawn to a small garden tucked behind the main building. Michelle lagged slightly, stopping to admire a patch of vibrant flowers. As she rounded a corner, she caught sight of Barack standing near the edge of the garden. His posture was rigid, his face unreadable as he listened to a conversation happening just out of sight. Michelle approached quietly, her curiosity piqued by the tension in his frame. As she drew closer, the voices reached her ears. "I don't care who they are," a man said, his tone clipped and dismissive. "This isn't the kind of place for them. We need to maintain a certain image." "But they're high-profile guests," another voice protested, softer but tinged with nervousness. "If they complain, they won't. People like them know better than to make waves." The words hit Michelle like a physical blow. She stepped closer to Barack, her presence breaking his trance. He turned to her, his expression a mix of anger and restraint. Without a word, he guided her back the way they had come, his hand a steadying presence on her arm. In the privacy of their suite, Barack finally spoke. "I recorded part of it," he said, holding up his phone. His voice was calm, but Michelle could hear the simmering frustration beneath. "It's not much, but it's enough to show what we're dealing with." Michelle sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "We can't ignore this, Barack. If we let it go, we're complicit." "I know," he said, his tone weary, "but we need to be smart about how we handle it. This isn't just about us. It's about everyone who comes here and gets treated the same way, or worse." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Michelle opened it to find Lucia, the housekeeper who had cleaned their room the day before. Her expression was cautious, but there was an urgency in her eyes. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michelle stepped aside to let her in, and Barack gestured for her to sit. Lucia hesitated, her gaze darting around the room as if checking for unseen observers. "I shouldn't be here," she said, wringing her hands. "But I overheard something this morning, and I thought you should know." She went on to describe a meeting she'd witnessed between the resort's management team. According to Lucia, they had explicitly discussed ways to downplay the Obama's complaints while ensuring that other guests, particularly those deemed more fitting, received impeccable service. The conversation had been laced with thinly veiled prejudice, the kind that was easy to deny but impossible to ignore. Michelle listened intently, her anger growing with each word. When Lucia finished, she looked at them with an expression that was equal parts fear and determination. "I've worked here for 3 years," Lucia said, "and it's always been like this. The staff who look like me, immigrants, people of color, we're treated like we're less than, and when guests like you come, it's worse. They don't want you here because you don't fit their idea of who belongs." Barack leaned forward, his tone gentle but firm. "Why are you telling us this? You're putting yourself at risk." Lucia hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "Because I'm tired of being afraid, and because I think you can do something about it." Her words hung in the air long after she left. Michelle turned to Barack, her resolve hardening. "We can't just let this slide," she said. "This isn't just about us. It's about everyone like Lucia who has to live with this every day." Barack nodded, but his expression was pensive. "We need to be careful. If we act too soon, without enough evidence, they'll dismiss us as overreacting. But if we wait too long, the moment might pass." The next few days were a blur of quiet observation and subtle action. Barack and Michelle began documenting everything: the dismissive service, the overheard conversations, the unequal treatment of staff and guests. They spoke to other employees, some of whom were hesitant to talk but shared enough to paint a clearer picture of the systemic discrimination that pervaded the resort. One evening, during dinner, the tension boiled over. Their waiter, the same one who had fumbled their order the previous night, accidentally spilled a glass of red wine on Michelle's dress. His apology was cursory at best, and the incident drew the attention of nearby diners. Some looked on with sympathy, while others whispered behind their hands, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disdain. Michelle handled the situation with grace, but inside she was seething. When they returned to their room, she vented her frustration. "This isn't just negligence," she said. "It's deliberate. They're trying to make us feel like we don't belong." Barack agreed, but his focus remained on the bigger picture. "We're getting close," he said, reviewing the evidence they'd gathered. "If we can get one more piece, something undeniable, we'll have enough to take this public." Their opportunity came sooner than expected. During another walk through the resort grounds, Barack overheard a heated conversation between the resort manager and a senior staff member. The manager's words were damning, an explicit directive to maintain the resort's exclusive atmosphere by discouraging undesirable guests. This time, Barack recorded the entire exchange. When he played it back for Michelle later, her reaction was immediate. "This is it," she said. "This is what we needed." They spent the rest of the evening preparing their case, ensuring that every piece of evidence was clear and irrefutable. By the time they were done, they had a compelling narrative that exposed the resort's culture of exclusion and discrimination. The next day, they made their move. Armed with their documentation, they approached a journalist they trusted, someone with a reputation for uncovering stories of systemic injustice. Within hours, the story was in motion, and the resort's carefully curated image began to unravel. As the fallout began, Michelle and Barack reflected on the events of the past week. They knew this was only the beginning of the fight, but they also knew they had taken an important first step. For Michelle, it was a reminder of the resilience and strength required to confront injustice. For Barack, it was a reaffirmation of the power of truth to challenge entrenched systems. And for both of them, it was a testament to their unwavering commitment to a more just and equitable world. The morning air was heavy with an eerie calm, as though the resort itself held its breath in anticipation. News of the expose had spread quickly. By the time Barack and Michelle stepped out of their suite, the ripple effects of their actions were already evident. Guests who had previously ignored them now cast furtive glances their way, curiosity and unease flickering across their faces. Michelle felt the weight of their decision as they walked toward the main building. The story had been published late the previous night, and the responses were pouring in: shock, outrage, and a growing call for accountability. Yet, amidst the chaos, there was an unsettling silence from the resort's management. No apologies, no attempts at damage control, just a brittle veneer of normalcy that only deepened the tension. Barack, ever the strategist, had spent the early hours of the morning reviewing the article and its reception. "They're going to try to frame this as an isolated incident," he had said to Michelle over coffee. "We need to make it clear that this isn't about one or two bad employees. It's about the entire system." Michelle had nodded, her resolve firm. "We're not backing down." As they entered the dining area for breakfast, the atmosphere was palpably different. Conversations hushed as they passed, and even the staff seemed unsure of how to approach them. Their usual table near the back of the restaurant was conspicuously empty, but Michelle wasn't in the mood to sit quietly. She guided Barack to a more central spot, one that placed them in full view of the other diners. The waiter who approached them was visibly nervous, his hands shaking slightly as he placed their menus on the table. Michelle offered him a polite smile, but the interaction was strained. She could feel the weight of the stares from the surrounding tables, a mixture of sympathy, judgment, and discomfort. Barack broke the silence. "Let's focus on what comes next," he said, his voice low enough not to carry but firm enough to ground them. "The story is out, but that's only the first step. We need to make sure it leads to real change." Before Michelle could respond, a familiar voice interrupted their conversation. Lucia stood a few feet away, her expression a mix of gratitude and trepidation. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Michelle gestured for her to join them. Lucia hesitated, glancing around as if to ensure she wasn't being watched, before sitting down. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What you've done, it's given people like me hope, but you should know they're trying to find out who talked to you." Michelle reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Lucia's. "We won't let anything happen to you," she said. "You have our word." Barack leaned forward. "Lucia, we're not done yet. If there's more you think people need to know, now's the time." Lucia hesitated, her eyes darting toward the kitchen door. "There's so much," she said finally. "The way they treat us, the way they treat guests who don't fit their image. It's been like this for years, but they cover it up so well. Anyone who speaks out loses their job, or worse." Her voice broke slightly, but she continued. When I first started here, I thought I was lucky to have this job, but it didn't take long to see the truth. They don't see us as people. We're just tools to them, and the guests who look like us, they're treated the same way." Michelle felt a surge of anger and sadness at Lucia's words. She glanced at Barack, who gave her a slight nod. They needed to do more. The rest of the day was a blur of tension and preparation. As Barack and Michelle worked to gather additional testimonials and evidence, the resort's management finally broke their silence. An email was sent to all guests, carefully worded to downplay the situation while promising an internal review. "We take these allegations very seriously," the email read. "Our commitment to inclusivity and excellence remains unwavering, and we will be conducting a thorough investigation to ensure that our standards are upheld." Michelle scoffed as she read it aloud. "Inclusivity and excellence," she repeated, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Is that what they call discrimination now?" Barack placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's damage control," he said. "They're trying to buy time, but we've got the momentum. Let's make sure they can't spin this." That evening, they met with a small group of staff members, including Lucia. The meeting was held in secret, in a quiet corner of the resort where they were unlikely to be overheard. One by one, the employees shared their stories, tales of unequal pay, verbal abuse, and a rigid hierarchy that placed certain staff members and guests above others. Lucia spoke last, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "I've seen people broken by this place," she said. "Good people who just wanted to do their jobs. They deserve better. We all do." Michelle reached out to her. "And we're going to fight for that," she said. "This isn't just about exposing the truth. It's about making sure things change." The group dispersed cautiously, each member slipping away into the night to avoid suspicion. As Michelle and Barack returned to their suite, the weight of what they had heard settled heavily on them. The fight was far from over, but they were determined to see it through. The next morning brought the first signs of progress. The story had gained traction, with more media outlets picking it up and amplifying the voices of the staff and guests who had come forward. Public pressure on the resort was mounting, and calls for accountability grew louder. But the resort wasn't going down without a fight. A letter from the resort's legal team arrived at their suite, accusing them of defamation and threatening legal action if they didn't retract their statements. Michelle read it twice before handing it to Barack, her expression a mixture of disbelief and defiance. "They're trying to intimidate us," she said, "but it's not going to work." Barack nodded, his jaw set. "Let them come. The truth is on our side." They responded by doubling down, providing more evidence to the press and giving a detailed interview about their experiences. Their story resonated with people around the world, sparking conversations about privilege, discrimination, and the hidden inequalities that persist in even the most exclusive spaces. By the end of the day, the resort's owners announced a public statement. They claimed to be taking the allegations seriously and promised sweeping changes, including the termination of several senior staff members. But for Michelle and Barack, the gesture felt hollow, a calculated move to save face rather than a genuine commitment to change. As they packed their bags to leave the resort, Michelle couldn't help but feel a sense of unfinished business. "This isn't over," she said, glancing at Barack. "Not by a long shot." He nodded, his expression resolute. "But it's a start, and sometimes that's enough to keep the fight going." As they left the resort behind, they knew they had ignited a spark. Whether it would lead to lasting change remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: they had refused to be silent in the face of injustice. and that, in itself, was a victory. The car ride from the resort to the small coastal airport was quiet, punctuated only by the rhythmic hum of the engine. Michelle stared out the window, her thoughts racing as the events of the past week replayed in her mind. The open sea stretched to the horizon, its vastness a stark contrast to the confining walls of injustice they had battled at the resort. Beside her, Barack tapped absently at his phone, scanning through a flood of messages and articles. The story had grown far beyond what either of them had anticipated. News outlets around the world were picking up the narrative, framing it not just as a scandal for one resort, but as a symbol of deeper systemic inequities in exclusive spaces. "We did what we could," Barack said finally, breaking the silence. "But this isn't just about us. This fight is bigger than a single place or a single week." Michelle nodded, her gaze still fixed on the rolling waves. "I know," she replied, "but it still feels unfinished." Their conversation was cut short as the driver pulled into the airport's drop-off zone. As they stepped out, a few onlookers recognized them, their murmurs and discreet phone cameras a reminder of the constant scrutiny they faced. Yet, even amid the familiar stares, Michelle noticed something different, a sense of respect, perhaps even admiration, from some of the faces in the crowd. Inside the small terminal, they found a quiet corner to wait for their flight. Barack continued scrolling through his phone, while Michelle opened her laptop to catch up on emails. It wasn't long before they were interrupted by a young woman, her face alight with a mix of nerves and determination. "Excuse me," she said, clutching a notepad to her chest. "I don't mean to bother you, but I just wanted to thank you for speaking out. It means so much to people like me." Michelle closed her laptop, giving the woman her full attention. "Thank you," she said warmly. "What's your name?" "Amara," the woman replied. "I'm a journalist. Well, a student journalist for now, but your story, it's inspired me. It's reminded me why I chose this path." Barack smiled, gesturing for her to sit. "Amara, you don't need our permission to tell the truth, but if there's one piece of advice I can give, it's this. Always look for the bigger picture. The story isn't just about what happens, it's about why it happens and how it can change." Amara nodded, her pen poised over her notepad. "Can I quote you on that?" They shared a laugh, the tension of the past days momentarily lifted. Amara thanked them again before disappearing into the terminal, her presence leaving a spark of hope in its wake. As their flight was called, Michelle and Barack boarded with a renewed sense of purpose. They had ignited a conversation, but the road ahead was long and the work was far from over. Back home in Washington, the media storm showed no signs of abating. The story had become a flashpoint, drawing attention to issues of racial and economic inequity in the hospitality industry. Former employees of the resort began coming forward with their own stories, adding layers of credibility and urgency to the narrative. Barack and Michelle worked tirelessly behind the scenes, leveraging their influence to amplify these voices. They partnered with advocacy groups and journalists, ensuring that the focus remained on the systemic issues rather than their personal experiences. Yet, as the movement grew, so did the backlash. Online trolls flooded social media with vitriol, accusing the Obamas of fabricating the story for attention. The resort's legal team escalated their threats, filing a defamation lawsuit designed to intimidate them into silence. Michelle read the court filing with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "They're doubling down," she said, handing the document to Barack. "They're trying to paint us as liars." Barack's expression was calm but steely. "They're scared," he said. and they should be. They know the truth is on our side. Their legal team quickly mobilized, crafting a defense that not only countered the resort's claims, but exposed further evidence of discriminatory practices. The case became a media spectacle, drawing even more attention to the underlying issues. Michelle found herself juggling conflicting emotions. On one hand, she was proud of the progress they were making, the conversations they were sparking. On the other, she felt the weight of the personal attacks, the relentless scrutiny, and the toll it was taking on her family. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of interviews and meetings, she sat alone in their living room, scrolling through social media. Amid the hateful comments, she found a message that stopped her cold. It was from Lucia. "Thank you for everything," the message read. "Because of you, I'm no longer afraid to speak up. I've joined a group of workers advocating for fair treatment, and we're fighting for change. I'll never forget what you did for us." Michelle felt a lump rise in her throat. She showed the message to Barack, who read it silently before meeting her gaze. "This is why we do it," he said simply. The breaking point came during a televised debate. The resort's CEO appeared on a primetime news program, attempting to discredit the Obamas and downplay the allegations. Michelle and Barack watched from their home, their frustration mounting as the CEO dismissed the staff's testimonies and framed the entire controversy as a misunderstanding. But the CEO's attempt to control the narrative backfired. The next day, a leaked email surfaced, revealing that the resort's management had knowingly implemented discriminatory policies. The email, shared anonymously by a former employee, was a smoking gun that confirmed everything the Obamas and others had alleged. The revelation sent shockwaves through the industry. The resort issued a public apology, and several senior staff members were fired. Advocacy groups seized the moment to push for broader reforms, calling for increased accountability and transparency in hospitality practices. For Michelle and Barack, the victory was bittersweet. They had achieved what they set out to do, expose the truth and spark change, but they knew the battle was far from over. Systemic issues required systemic solutions, and the road ahead would be long and arduous. As they reflected on the journey, Michelle found solace in the small victories. Lucia's courage, Amara's determination, the voices that had been amplified, and the awareness that had been raised, these were the moments that reminded her why the fight was worth it. Barack, ever the optimist, saw the bigger picture. "This isn't just about a resort," he said one evening as they sat together on their porch. "It's about changing the culture, and that takes time." Michelle leaned into him, her resolve as strong as ever. "Then we'll keep fighting," she said, "for as long as it takes." The stars twinkled above them, a quiet reminder of the vastness of the world and the small but significant role they played in shaping it. The rain pattered softly against the windows of their home, a gentle rhythm that contrasted with the storm of attention their actions had unleashed. It had been weeks since the story broke, yet its impact continued to ripple through the media, the hospitality industry, and beyond. Michelle sat by the living room window, watching the droplets trace erratic paths down the glass. A steaming mug of tea rested in her hands, the warmth grounding her as her thoughts drifted. Barack entered the room, a thick folder in his hands. He set it down on the table before joining her on the couch. His presence, calm and steady, was a comfort. "The latest reports from the advocacy groups," he said, nodding toward the folder, "they're seeing real momentum. Workers are coming forward, sharing their stories. It's starting to build into something bigger." Michelle gave a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's a start," she said, "but it doesn't feel like enough." Barack leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "It never does. Change is slow, but every step matters." The folder on the table represented the tangible results of their efforts: worker testimonies, proposals for industry reforms, and updates on the ongoing investigation into the resort. All signs of progress. Yet the weight of what remained undone was heavy, a reminder that systemic change required more than headlines and public outcry. The fallout from the scandal had been swift and far-reaching. The resort's parent company had faced immense public pressure, forcing them to announce a series of changes. New diversity training programs, revised hiring practices, and a commitment to creating a more inclusive environment. Yet Michelle and Barack were skeptical. The promises felt performative, a desperate attempt to salvage the company's reputation rather than a genuine effort to address the root issues. Meanwhile, the legal battle raged on. The resort had quietly dropped its defamation lawsuit after the leaked email exposed their culpability, but other challenges arose. Industry lobbyists pushed back against calls for regulation, framing them as unnecessary interference in private business practices. The backlash was a stark reminder of the resistance that often accompanied progress. Michelle found herself grappling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she was proud of what they had accomplished. Their actions had shone a spotlight on entrenched inequalities, given a voice to those who had long been silenced. On the other hand, the sheer magnitude of the problem felt overwhelming. For every step forward, there were countless barriers to overcome. One evening, as she and Barack reviewed the latest developments, Michelle voiced her frustration. "We've exposed the truth, but what if it doesn't lead to real change? What if it's just another story that fades away?" Barack set down the papers he was holding and turned to her. "It's not going to fade," he said firmly, "because we won't let it, and neither will the people we've inspired. This isn't just about us, Michelle. It's about everyone who sees what's happening and decides to take action." His words were a balm to her weary spirit. Michelle nodded, her resolve rekindled. "Then we keep going," she said, "for as long as it takes." In the weeks that followed, they threw themselves into the work. Barack collaborated with policymakers to draft proposals for industry reforms, focusing on accountability and transparency. Michelle connected with advocacy groups and community leaders, amplifying the voices of workers who had been marginalized for far too long. Their efforts culminated in a public forum held in Washington, D.C., bringing together workers, activists, and industry leaders. The event was a powerful testament to the strength of collective action. Lucia was among the speakers, her voice steady as she recounted her experiences at the resort. "For years, I stayed silent because I was afraid," she said. "But silence only protects those who harm us. Speaking out has given me my dignity back, and I'll never go back to being silent." The audience erupted in applause, a wave of support that underscored the importance of her words. Michelle watched from the front row, her chest swelling with pride. Lucia's courage was a reminder of why they had taken this fight on in the first place. As the forum concluded, Michelle and Barack found a quiet moment to reflect. They stood by the edge of the stage, watching as attendees mingled and shared their stories. The energy in the room was palpable, a blend of determination and hope. "We've started something," Michelle said, her voice filled with a quiet satisfaction. "Something that feels real." Barack nodded, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "It is real, and it's just the beginning." The forum marked a turning point, but it was clear that the road ahead would be long and challenging. The hospitality industry was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, and the systemic issues they had uncovered were deeply entrenched. Yet, amidst the challenges, there were moments of hope. Workers who had been silenced were finding their voices. Advocacy groups were gaining traction, pushing for meaningful reforms, and the public was beginning to recognize the hidden inequalities that shaped so many aspects of society. For Michelle and Barack, these moments were a source of strength. They knew that the fight for justice was a marathon, not a sprint. And while the battle might never be fully won, every step forward was a victory worth celebrating. Back at home, life began to settle into a new rhythm. The media frenzy subsided, replaced by quieter but no less impactful efforts to drive change. Michelle and Barack continued their work, balancing their advocacy with the demands of their personal lives. One evening, as they sat together on their porch, the rain began to fall again, a gentle drizzle that softened the edges of the world around them. Barack gazed out at the darkened sky, his thoughts seemingly far away. "Do you ever feel like we're not doing enough?" Michelle asked, breaking the silence. Barack turned to her, a small smile playing on his lips. "All the time," he admitted. "But then I remind myself that change isn't about doing everything. It's about doing something. And if enough people do something, it adds up." Michelle nodded, his words settling over her like a warm blanket. She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. The rain continued to fall, a quiet symphony that underscored the stillness of the moment. They sat like that for a long time, their thoughts intertwined with the rhythm of the rain. The fight was far from over, but for now they allowed themselves a moment of peace, a reminder that even in the midst of struggle, there was room for hope. And as the night deepened, Michelle found herself thinking not about the battles they had yet to fight, but about the victories they had already won. Each step forward was a testament to the power of resilience, courage, and the unyielding belief in a better world. Injustice, she knew, would never be entirely eradicated, but as long as there were people willing to stand up and speak out, the fight would continue. And that, she thought, was enough for now. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss upcoming stories. Explore more of our videos to uncover new perspectives, and if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we can inspire change.